In the grand and often frustrating world of arguments, debates and discussions, few logical fallacies are as common or as exasperating as the straw man fallacy. It is a sneaky trick, an intellectual shortcut, and sometimes an outright dishonest move used to distort an opponent's argument, making it easier to attack. Instead of engaging with the real substance of what someone is saying, the straw man fallacy builds a weaker, often ridiculous version of their point, and then proceeds to tear that flimsy version apart. It's a bit like stepping into a boxing ring, only to find that your opponent has swapped you out for a scarecrow and is now proudly pummeling it into the ground, declaring victory. But you were never given a chance to actually defend your position. That's the core of why this fallacy is so frustrating. It misrepresents a person's true stance, making it easier to refute or mock while sidestepping the real argument. One of the most classic examples goes something like this. Imagine someone suggests a specific policy to combat climate change, such as investing in renewable energy. Their opponent, instead of debating the merits of that idea, responds by saying, "Oh, so you think we should just do nothing about climate change?" That's not what was said. But now, instead of having a thoughtful discussion about renewable energy's benefits and drawbacks, the debate shifts to defending against a fabricated position that was never proposed in the first place. This logical fallacy shows up in just about every arena where people argue: politics, media, social media, even casual conversations between friends. It's incredibly effective because, on the surface, it can seem like a real rebuttal. The audience, especially if they are not paying close attention, might not even notice that the original argument has been twisted into something it never was. This is what makes the straw man such a powerful and damaging rhetorical tool. The problem is that it leads discussions away from productive disagreement and into a battleground of misrepresentation. When someone engages in a straw man argument, they are not interested in honest discussion, they are interested in winning. They aren't trying to understand or fairly challenge an idea, they're trying to dismantle a false version of it, one that they have deliberately weakened. Consider, for example, how the straw man fallacy appears in political debates. A candidate might propose increasing taxes on the wealthiest individuals to fund public infrastructure. Instead of arguing about whether or not this policy is effective, their opponent might respond by saying, "My opponent wants to tax everyone into poverty." That's not what was suggested. But now, instead of debating tax policy, the conversation has shifted to defending against an exaggerated and inaccurate claim. Or take another example. Someone might argue for more responsible gun control laws, such as universal background checks. Instead of engaging with that idea, their opponent might say, "Oh, so you want to take away everyone's guns?" Again, that was never suggested. But suddenly, the argument has been distorted, and the original point is lost in the noise of the misrepresentation. Straw man arguments can also be subtle, not just overt distortions. Sometimes they come in the form of oversimplification. If someone makes a complex argument with multiple layers, a straw man response might pick out one small aspect of it and exaggerate it beyond recognition. Suppose a person argues that there should be some regulations on free speech to prevent harm, such as laws against incitement to violence. Their opponent might say, "So you think the government should control everything people say?" That's not what was argued, but it makes it easier to attack. What makes the straw man fallacy particularly dangerous is that it's often persuasive to those who are not carefully analysing the discussion. If a politician, debater, or even a casual speaker can make their opponent's position sound ridiculous, they gain an advantage. The audience might not notice the misrepresentation, or they might already be inclined to believe the false version of the argument because it aligns with their pre-existing biases. The fallacy is also a major culprit in the spread of misinformation. Social media is especially fertile ground for straw man arguments. A nuanced and carefully articulated opinion can easily be turned into a misleading soundbite that completely distorts its original intent. Someone might write a thoughtful piece on the need for systemic economic reform, and within hours, critics on Twitter will be responding with claims like, "Oh, so you just want to turn the country into a communist dictatorship." This type of distortion is not just frustrating for those being misrepresented, it's also harmful to the broader conversation. When ideas are consistently misrepresented, it becomes nearly impossible to have meaningful discussions. Instead of exploring different viewpoints in good faith, Debates devolve into defending against caricatures of one's position. So how do we fight back against the straw man fallacy? The first step is recognizing it. Once you can identify when someone is misrepresenting an argument, you can call it out. Pointing out that an opponent is attacking a position that was never actually taken can be a powerful way to refocus the conversation on the real issue. Another strategy is to clarify and restate one's own position as precisely as possible. If someone says, "So you just want to do nothing about climate change?" one might respond with, "No, that's not what I said. I actually suggested X, Y, and Z as solutions." This forces the discussion back onto the real argument rather than the misrepresentation. Additionally, fostering intellectual honesty in debates and discussions helps prevent straw man arguments from taking over. Engaging with what people actually say rather than what we assume or want them to say leads to more meaningful exchanges of ideas. If people make a genuine effort to understand opposing views rather than distort them, discussions become much more productive. Of course, there will always be those who deliberately use the straw man fallacy to manipulate and mislead. In these cases, the best course of action may simply be to disengage. If someone refuses to argue in good faith, then there may be little point in continuing the conversation. Not every argument is worth having, and not every opponent is interested in honest discussion. Ultimately, the straw man fallacy is a reflection of our broader challenges in communication. In a world filled with complex ideas and competing perspectives, it can be tempting to simplify, distort, or misrepresent arguments to make them easier to attack. But if we truly want to understand one another and engage in meaningful dialogue, we must resist this temptation. By striving for intellectual honesty and refusing to fall for the straw man's deceptive tricks, we can move toward conversations that actually lead somewhere, rather than just knocking down scarecrows all day. In the world of debate and discussion, where logic and reasoning are supposed to be the guiding principles, the ad hominem fallacy stands out as one of the most frustrating and intellectually dishonest tactics people use. Instead of engaging with the actual argument being made, ad hominem attacks shift the focus away from ideas and onto the person presenting them. It's a strategy that bypasses rational discourse entirely, turning what could be a productive exchange of ideas into a personal battle of character assassinations. At its core, the ad hominem fallacy occurs when someone tries to discredit an argument by attacking the person making it rather than the argument itself. This can take many forms, from outright insults to more subtle character judgments meant to undermine credibility. If you've ever encountered someone who dismisses an argument simply by saying, "You don't know what you're talking about," or "You're just a bad person," instead of addressing the substance of what was said, you've witnessed an ad hominem attack in action. One of the classic examples of this fallacy happens in political debates. Suppose a candidate proposes a policy idea such as increasing funding for public schools. Instead of discussing the merits of this policy, their opponent might respond by saying, "Well, of course you'd say that. You're just a corrupt politician who only cares about getting re-elected." The problem here is that the personal attack doesn't actually engage with the policy itself. Even if the politician is corrupt, that fact alone doesn't make their proposal invalid. Good ideas can come from bad people, and bad ideas can come from good people. Focusing on the person instead of the idea is simply a way to avoid meaningful discussion. Ad hominem arguments are particularly effective because they tap into our emotions. Humans are naturally inclined to judge people, and if someone can make us feel negatively about the person making an argument, we might be less inclined to take their words seriously. This is why personal attacks are so common in political campaigns, media discourse, and social media arguments. It's far easier to turn public opinion against a person than it is to carefully dissect and dismantle their ideas. One of the more insidious aspects of ad hominem fallacies is that they often masquerade as legitimate critiques. Instead of outright saying, "You're a bad person," someone might imply that an individual's background, affiliations, or past mistakes make them unqualified to speak on an issue. For example, if someone argues for criminal justice reform, an opponent might respond, "You've never been to law school, so your opinion doesn't count." This type of attack suggests that only certain people, those with specific credentials or experiences, are allowed to participate in discussions, which is not a reasonable way to evaluate arguments. Good arguments stand on their own merit, regardless of who makes them. Another common form of ad hominem is guilt by association. This occurs when someone's argument is dismissed based on who they are connected to rather than what they are actually saying. Suppose a scientist presents research on climate change and their detractors respond, "Well, you once worked for a government agency that had a bad reputation, so we can't trust you." This line of reasoning does not address the actual research. Instead, it relies on tarnishing the person's reputation to discredit their work. Ad hominem attacks are not just a tool of political and ideological battles, they also appear in everyday discussions. Imagine a workplace dispute where an employee suggests a change in company policy. Instead of debating the merits of the suggestion, a colleague dismisses it by saying, "Well, nobody likes you anyway, so why should we listen to you?" This kind of reasoning is not just unproductive, it's downright toxic. It turns a conversation about ideas into a contest of personal approval, where logic is abandoned in favour of social dynamics. Social media has amplified the use of ad hominem fallacies to an almost unbearable degree. Online debates rarely stay focused on the actual subject matter. Instead, discussions quickly devolve into attacks on intelligence, morality, or personal history. If someone makes a controversial statement, it's common to see responses like, "Well, you have no right to speak on this issue because of something you tweeted 10 years ago." Instead of engaging with the argument at hand, people dig into an individual's past, looking for anything that can be used to undermine their credibility. A particularly destructive version of the ad hominem fallacy is when it's used to silence opposition entirely. If someone voices an unpopular opinion, instead of debating the merits of their perspective, opponents might label them with a derogatory term meant to discredit them outright. This happens frequently in discussions about sensitive social issues. If someone expresses skepticism about a particular policy, they may be branded with a label that suggests they are hateful or ignorant, even if their argument is reasonable and well-founded. The goal in such cases is not to refute the argument, but to intimidate the person into silence. One of the most unfortunate consequences of the ad hominem fallacy is that it discourages meaningful conversation. When people feel that they will be personally attacked for expressing their views, they are less likely to engage in discussion at all. This leads to echo chambers, where only those who agree with a particular viewpoint feel safe to speak, and dissenting opinions are driven underground. As a result, society becomes more polarized, and the possibility of genuine dialogue diminishes. So how can we counter ad hominem attacks? The first step is to recognize when they are happening. If you find yourself in a discussion where someone is attacking you instead of your argument, point it out, saying something like, "That's not actually addressing my point. Can we focus on the argument itself?" can help steer the conversation back on track. Another effective strategy is to refuse to take the bait. If someone tries to provoke you with a personal attack, staying calm and redirecting the discussion to the actual issue can be a powerful way to undermine the effectiveness of the fallacy. Personal attacks are often meant to elicit an emotional reaction, so responding with patience and logic can help diffuse the situation. It's also important to hold ourselves to higher standards in debate. Even when we strongly disagree with someone, attacking their character instead of engaging with their ideas weakens our own position. If we want to encourage rational discourse, we must be willing to address arguments fairly, even when they come from people we dislike. Ad hominem attacks may be a staple of modern argumentation, but they do nothing to advance understanding. They distract, distort, and divide. By recognizing them for what they are and refusing to participate in personal attacks, we can create an environment where real discussion can take place. After all, if the goal is to seek truth and understanding, then attacking people instead of engaging with their ideas is a step in the wrong direction. In the world of logical fallacies, few are as deceptively persuasive and limiting as the false dilemma. Also known as the false dichotomy or black and white thinking, this fallacy occurs when someone presents a situation as having only two possible choices, when in reality more options exist. It is a classic technique used in politics, advertising, social movements, and even everyday conversations to push people into making a choice that aligns with the speaker's agenda. By eliminating nuance and complexity, the false dilemma oversimplifies issues and forces people into artificial binaries that do not reflect reality. A classic example of this fallacy is the phrase, "You are either with us or against us." This kind of statement makes it seem as though there are only two possible positions, complete allegiance or total opposition. It leaves no room for people who might partially agree but have reservations, or those who want to remain neutral. The false dilemma is particularly effective because it exploits human psychology. We like clear choices, and we often feel uncomfortable navigating the grey areas of complex issues. This fallacy appears frequently in political rhetoric. Consider a politician who argues, "You either support this tax cut or you want the economy to collapse." This argument ignores the possibility that someone might oppose the tax cut for different economic reasons or support alternative solutions to economic growth. It deliberately restricts the range of choices to force people into accepting one of the presented options, even when reality is more complicated. The false dilemma is also rampant in media and social discourse. Take the way debates about environmental policies are often framed: either you support this specific regulation or you don't care about the planet. This kind of argument disregards the fact that there might be alternative solutions, different approaches, or even disagreements about how effective the regulation is. Someone might deeply care about environmental conservation but believe that a different policy would be more effective. Marketing and advertising are full of false dilemmas as well. Companies use this technique to push consumers toward their products by presenting limited options. Consider a commercial that says, "You can either buy our premium organic skincare or keep exposing your skin to toxic chemicals." This framing ignores the fact that there might be other organic brands, homemade remedies, or products that are both affordable and safe. By reducing the choices to an exaggerated contrast, advertisers manipulate consumers into making a purchase. The false dilemma is particularly damaging in social and ideological debates. When people are told, "You either believe in absolute free speech or you support censorship," they are forced to choose between two extreme positions, even though free speech issues often require nuanced discussion about limits and responsibilities. The same happens in debates about government policies, healthcare, education, and nearly every major issue. Complex problems rarely have only two possible solutions, yet people are often pressured into picking a side as if those are the only available options. In personal relationships, the false dilemma can be used to manipulate emotions and control behavior. A partner might say, "If you really love me, you would do this for me," implying that love can only be expressed in one way, and ignoring the possibility of different ways to show affection and commitment. This kind of reasoning creates unnecessary tension and forces choices that do not reflect the full range of possibilities in a relationship. One reason the false dilemma is so persuasive is that it taps into our need for certainty. Human brains prefer simple explanations over complex ones. When given a choice between two extremes, people often feel pressured to pick one, even if they're not completely comfortable with either. This is especially true in high-pressure situations where making a quick decision feels necessary. However, accepting a false dilemma means ignoring the richer, more complicated reality of most issues. So how can we avoid falling for the false dilemma? The first step is recognizing when it is being used. Whenever an argument presents only two options, ask yourself whether more possibilities exist. In most cases, there will be alternatives that were not mentioned. By questioning the premise of the argument, you can avoid being trapped in artificial choices. Another strategy is to reframe the discussion. Instead of accepting the presented options, introduce a third or fourth possibility. If someone says, "You either support this law or you don't care about justice," you might respond with, "Actually, I think there are multiple ways to achieve justice, and I'd like to explore other solutions." This approach forces the discussion into a more nuanced and honest direction. Encouraging critical thinking is another powerful way to counter the false dilemma. When people are taught to recognize logical fallacies and question oversimplified arguments, they become less susceptible to manipulation. Schools, media, and public discourse should all play a role in promoting more thoughtful discussions that acknowledge complexity rather than reducing everything to simplistic choices. It's also important to hold those who use false dilemmas accountable. If politicians, media outlets, or influencers consistently frame debates in black and white terms, calling out the fallacy can help shift the conversation. Public awareness of these tactics weakens their effectiveness, making it harder for people to get away with false choices. The false dilemma may be one of the most pervasive fallacies in modern discourse, but it is not unbeatable. By recognizing it, questioning its premises, and demanding more nuanced discussions, we can resist the pressure to choose between artificially limited options. Life is rarely as simple as either this or that. The world is full of complexity, and acknowledging it is the first step toward better reasoning and more productive conversations. In the vast landscape of logical fallacies, the slippery slope is one of the most common and persuasive, yet also one of the most misleading. At its core, the slippery slope fallacy assumes that allowing one small event to occur will inevitably lead to a chain reaction of increasingly significant and usually negative consequences, even when there is little to no evidence that such a progression will actually happen. It is an argument built on fear and speculation rather than sound reasoning, and it often serves as a way to discourage action or debate by painting extreme worst-case scenarios as unavoidable outcomes. Consider a common example. A teacher suggests allowing students to redo a single test if they performed poorly. Instead of evaluating the merits of this idea, someone responds, "If we let students redo this test, next they'll want to redo every assignment, and before you know it, the entire education system will collapse." This argument assumes that a single reasonable action, allowing a retest, will inevitably snowball into widespread academic chaos. However, there is no logical necessity that permitting one retest will lead to the collapse of the education system. It ignores the possibility of setting reasonable limits, using discretion, or implementing the change in a controlled manner. The slippery slope fallacy thrives in debates where emotions run high, and people fear potential negative consequences, even if those fears are exaggerated or unwarranted. One of the most frequent arenas where this fallacy appears is politics. When discussing policy changes, opponents often invoke worst-case scenarios to argue against even small reforms. For example, someone arguing against stricter gun regulations might say, "If we allow this one gun control measure, the government will take away all our guns and soon we'll be living in a totalitarian state." This argument ignores the fact that many countries have gun regulations without descending into tyranny. It presents an extreme outcome as inevitable when, in reality, multiple steps and factors would be required for such a scenario to unfold. The slippery slope is also a favourite tactic in moral and social debates. When discussing issues like drug legalization, opponents often argue, if we legalize marijuana, then people will start using harder drugs, and soon society will be overrun with addicts. While concerns about drug use are valid, this argument assumes an automatic and uncontrollable escalation without acknowledging variables such as regulation, personal choice, and other societal factors that influence behaviour. Just because one step is taken does not mean the most extreme possible consequence must follow. In legal and governmental discourse, the slippery slope is often used to argue against judicial decisions or policy changes. For example, in debates over free speech, some argue, if we allow restrictions on hate speech, soon the government will start banning any speech they don't like, and eventually we won't have free speech at all. While it is important to be cautious about government overreach, this argument assumes that any regulation of speech will inevitably lead to absolute censorship, ignoring the possibility of nuanced, well-defined policies that protect both free speech and public safety. The fallacy also makes frequent appearances in discussions about technology and innovation. When artificial intelligence began making significant advances, some argued, if we allow AI to perform basic tasks, soon it will replace all human jobs and eventually AI will take over the world. While concerns about automation and job displacement are legitimate, this argument exaggerates the likelihood of an uncontrollable chain reaction leading to complete AI domination. It disregards economic policies, human decision-making, and technological safeguards that influence how AI is integrated into society. The slippery slope is effective as a rhetorical tool because it taps into human anxieties. People are naturally inclined to worry about the future and potential negative consequences. By painting a vivid picture of disaster, the slippery slope fallacy bypasses rational discussion and triggers an emotional response. Instead of evaluating whether a proposed change is reasonable, people are made to feel that even considering the first step will lead to inevitable ruin. How can we counter the slippery slope fallacy? The first step is to recognize when it is being used. If an argument suggests that one action will automatically lead to a drastic outcome without solid evidence, it is worth questioning the assumption. Ask whether there are actual mechanisms that make such a progression inevitable, or whether safeguards, regulations, and common sense can prevent the worst-case scenario from happening. Another way to challenge the slippery slope is to demand proof. If someone claims that a minor change will lead to extreme consequences, ask for historical examples where this has actually occurred. Often people making these arguments rely on speculation rather than real-world evidence. By shifting the conversation from fear-based reasoning to factual analysis, it becomes easier to separate legitimate concerns from exaggerated fears. It is also helpful to remind people that most changes do not happen in a vacuum. Societies have checks and balances, laws can be revised, and people can adapt. Just because one step is taken does not mean that every subsequent step will necessarily follow. Policies and social norms evolve through debate, revision, and compromise, not through a predetermined, unstoppable sequence of events. In some cases, slippery slope arguments contain a kernel of truth. Some actions do set precedents that influence future decisions. However, the mistake lies in assuming that the most extreme outcome is guaranteed, rather than acknowledging that each step in a process is a choice that can be evaluated on its own merits. Instead of rejecting an idea outright due to fears of where it might lead, a more rational approach is to assess the idea itself while considering ways to prevent potential negative consequences. Ultimately, the slippery slope fallacy is a tool of fear, not reason. It discourages discussion, prevents incremental progress, and forces people into an all-or-nothing mindset. By recognizing it, questioning its assumptions, and demanding evidence, we can resist the urge to succumb to exaggerated fears and engage in more thoughtful, productive debates. Change is not always a slippery slope to disaster. It is often a staircase that can be climbed carefully, one step at a time. Circular reasoning is one of the most deceptive yet common logical fallacies, often appearing in everyday conversations, debates, and even formal arguments. At its core, circular reasoning occurs when the conclusion of an argument is used as its own evidence, creating a loop of reasoning that proves nothing beyond itself. This fallacy gives the illusion of logic while failing to provide any real support for its claims. A classic example of circular reasoning is the statement, "The Bible is true because it says so in the Bible." In this case, the claim that the Bible is true is supported by an appeal to the Bible itself, which is the very thing that needs to be proven. Instead of offering external evidence or justification, the argument simply loops back to its starting point, assuming its own conclusion rather than proving it. Circular reasoning often appears in discussions about authority and belief. For instance, a student might argue, "My teacher is always right because she said she is always right." This reasoning relies on the teacher's authority as its only justification, without providing any independent verification. Similarly, in political debates, someone might say, "This policy is the best choice because the government says it is the best choice," without providing any actual evidence for why the policy is effective. Such arguments assume their own correctness instead of proving it. One reason circular reasoning is so appealing is that it can feel intuitively correct. People naturally trust familiar sources, so when a statement reaffirms something they already believe, they may not recognize the fallacious reasoning behind it. Circular arguments often sound persuasive because they provide the comfort of self-confirmation rather than the challenge of critical thinking. Another common form of circular reasoning appears in moral or ethical debates. Someone might argue stealing is wrong because it is immoral. While this may seem like a reasonable statement, it does not provide an actual reason for why stealing is immoral. It merely restates the premise in different words. A stronger argument would explain why stealing causes harm or violates ethical principles rather than simply asserting its immorality as a given. Religious and philosophical debates frequently encounter circular reasoning, especially when discussing fundamental beliefs. For example, someone might say, "God exists because the Holy Book says so, and the Holy Book is true because it is the Word of God." This reasoning assumes the existence of God in order to prove the truth of the Holy Book, which in turn is used as evidence for God's existence. While faith-based beliefs do not necessarily require logical proof, arguments meant to persuade others should rely on independent reasoning rather than circular justification. Circular reasoning is also found in legal and bureaucratic systems. A company might defend a flawed policy by saying, "This is our rule because it is company policy." Such a statement provides no justification beyond restating the policy itself, ignoring the possibility of re-evaluating its necessity or fairness. In legal arguments, a lawyer might claim this law is just because it follows the legal system, without explaining why the legal system itself is just. These examples show how circular reasoning can reinforce existing structures without critical examination. In science and academia, Circular reasoning is a serious flaw that undermines the validity of arguments. A researcher might claim this theory is correct because all the data supports it, but if the data itself was selected based on the assumption that the theory is correct, the reasoning becomes circular. Good scientific arguments rely on independently verifiable evidence rather than self-referential claims. One of the dangers of circular reasoning is that it creates an illusion of certainty without actually proving anything. Because the argument loops back on itself, it prevents meaningful discussion and critical analysis. People who rely on circular reasoning often dismiss opposing viewpoints by restating their original claim rather than addressing counter-arguments. This makes it difficult to engage in productive dialogue, as the argument simply reinforces itself rather than responding to evidence or alternative perspectives. So how can we recognize and avoid circular reasoning? One strategy is to ask, what is the actual evidence for this claim? If the argument simply restates itself without introducing new information, it is likely circular. Another approach is to break down the argument into its premises and conclusion. If the conclusion is simply a reworded version of a premise, then the reasoning is flawed. Another way to counter circular reasoning is to demand external justification. Instead of accepting a claim at face value, ask for independent evidence or alternative explanations. If someone argues, this book is the best because everyone says it's the best, ask what criteria make it the best, rather than relying on popularity as the sole justification. Recognizing circular reasoning is an essential skill for critical thinking. It helps us avoid being misled by arguments that sound convincing but lack real substance. By questioning assumptions, demanding independent evidence, and engaging in thoughtful analysis, we can move beyond self-referential claims and build stronger, more logical arguments. Whether in personal discussions, political debates, or academic inquiry, avoiding circular reasoning allows for deeper understanding and more meaningful conversations. The appeal to authority is one of the most pervasive and misleading logical fallacies, often slipping into arguments unnoticed because of how naturally people tend to trust authority figures. At its core, this fallacy occurs when someone uses the opinion or endorsement of an authority figure as definitive proof of a claim, even if that authority is not qualified in the relevant field. While expertise and experience are important in forming opinions, they do not automatically make an argument true. The problem with the appeal to authority is that it replaces critical thinking and evidence-based reasoning with blind trust in an individual's status or reputation. A common example of this fallacy is when someone says, "This diet works because a famous actor said so." While the actor may be well known and respected, their expertise is in acting, not nutrition or medicine. Their opinion does not serve as scientific proof that the diet is effective. The assumption that their fame or success in one area grants them credibility in another is a mistake. Yet this kind of reasoning is used frequently in advertising, political debates, and even academic discussions. Appeals to authority are especially common in the world of marketing and advertising. Companies often rely on celebrity endorsements to promote products, regardless of whether the celebrity has any expertise in the product's field. For example, a sportswear company may have a famous athlete endorse a particular brand of running shoes, which might make sense because the athlete is experienced in using sports equipment. However, if the same athlete were to promote a vitamin supplement or a financial investment plan, their endorsement carries little actual weight because they are not experts in nutrition or finance. This tactic works because people tend to associate credibility with fame, even when the two are unrelated. The appeal to authority fallacy is also widely used in political and social debates. People often assume that because a politician, religious leader, or public figure expresses a particular opinion, that opinion must be correct. For instance, if a well-known business executive claims that a certain economic policy is the best solution for a country's financial problems, many people might accept it as fact without questioning whether the executive has any background in economic policy. The same happens when public figures outside the scientific community make declarations about climate change, vaccines, or other scientific topics that require specialized knowledge. Just because someone is successful or influential does not mean they are automatically right about everything they discuss. This fallacy can also be observed in academia when students or researchers cite experts without critically evaluating their arguments. For example, someone might say, "This theory must be correct because a famous professor supports it," without examining the actual evidence behind the theory. While experts are valuable sources of knowledge, Their claims must still be scrutinized and supported by empirical data rather than accepted at face value. Even respected scientists can be wrong, and history is full of examples where widely accepted expert opinions were later proven incorrect. Religious and philosophical arguments often rely on appeals to authority as well. A person might argue, "This belief must be true because my religious leader says so," or "This philosophical idea is correct because an ancient philosopher wrote about it." While religious leaders and philosophers may provide valuable insights, their words alone do not constitute proof. Ideas must be evaluated based on logic, evidence, and their real-world implications, rather than the prestige of the person who proposed them. The danger of the appeal to authority fallacy is that it discourages independent thinking. When people rely on the words of an authority figure, rather than examining the evidence, they become passive acceptors of information rather than active thinkers. This can lead to misinformation, blind obedience, and resistance to questioning flawed or outdated ideas. It also creates an environment where individuals with power and influence can shape opinions without accountability, simply because people trust them without demanding proof. However, it is important to distinguish between legitimate expertise and fallacious appeals to authority. Not all references to authority figures are fallacious. Relying on expert opinions is often necessary when dealing with complex subjects. The key difference lies in whether the authority figure has relevant expertise in the field and whether their claims are backed by evidence. If a physicist makes a statement about quantum mechanics, their expertise gives their opinion credibility. But if the same physicist makes a statement about nutrition, their authority does not automatically make them a reliable source in that area. The fallacy occurs when authority is used as a substitute for actual reasoning and evidence. One way to avoid falling for the appeal to authority is to ask critical questions about the source of information. Is the authority figure actually qualified in the relevant field? Do they provide evidence to support their claims, or are they simply relying on their reputation? Are there other experts in the field who disagree with them? And if so, why? These questions help separate genuine expertise from misleading appeals to authority. Another way to counter this fallacy is to focus on evidence rather than individuals. Instead of asking, "Who said this?" ask, "What is the evidence for this claim?" This shift in perspective encourages a more analytical approach to evaluating information and reduces the influence of personal bias. It also helps to cross-check claims with multiple sources rather than relying on a single authority figure. Ultimately, the appeal to authority is a shortcut that can lead to flawed reasoning and poor decision-making. While expert opinions are valuable, they should never replace critical thinking, logical analysis, and a demand for solid evidence. By recognizing this fallacy and questioning authoritative claims, we can develop a more informed and independent approach to understanding the world. One of the most common logical fallacies in reasoning and decision-making is the confusion between correlation and causation. This fallacy occurs when someone assumes that because two events happen together, one must be causing the other. While it is true that a causal relationship can sometimes exist between correlated events, correlation alone is not sufficient evidence to prove causation. Many unrelated variables can be associated simply by coincidence or due to an underlying factor influencing both events. Failing to recognize this distinction leads to faulty conclusions, misinformed decisions, and widespread misinformation. To illustrate this fallacy, consider the example. Ice cream sales increase when crime rates go up, so ice cream must cause crime. This statement assumes a direct cause and effect relationship between the two variables. However, the real explanation is likely that both crime rates and ice cream sales tend to rise during hot weather. The heat makes people more likely to buy ice cream, while also potentially increasing tensions and interactions that lead to crime. In this case, temperature is a hidden third factor known as a confounding variable that influences both events. The mistake here is assuming that just because two things happen at the same time, one must be responsible for the other. Correlation occurs when two variables are related in some way, meaning they tend to move together. This can be measured using statistical techniques, often resulting in a correlation coefficient that shows the strength and direction of the relationship. However, correlation does not establish causation, which means proving that one event directly causes another. To establish causation, researchers must conduct controlled experiments, rule out confounding variables, and provide a logical explanation for the connection. A classic example of the correlation versus causation fallacy is the link between the number of storks and human birth rates in certain rural areas. Data has shown that regions with more storks also have higher birth rates, leading to the misleading conclusion that storks deliver babies. The real reason behind this correlation is that both birth rates and stork populations are higher in rural areas with lower population density. The presence of storks does not influence human reproduction, but an underlying factor, rural living conditions, accounts for the observed correlation. The confusion between correlation and causation is particularly problematic in health and medical research. Many studies report correlations between lifestyle factors and health outcomes, but these correlations do not always imply a direct cause. For example, studies have found that people who drink more coffee tend to live longer. While this might suggest that coffee consumption increases lifespan, other factors could be at play. Coffee drinkers may have different dietary habits, socio-economic statuses, or access to healthcare that contribute to their longevity. Without further research to control for these factors, it is incorrect to assume that drinking coffee directly causes a longer life. Another misleading correlation can be seen in diet and disease. Suppose a study finds that people who eat more vegetables have lower rates of heart disease. While this might imply that eating vegetables directly prevents heart disease, other factors could explain the relationship. People who eat more vegetables may also exercise more, avoid smoking, or follow other healthy habits that reduce their risk of heart disease. Without isolating these variables, it is impossible to determine whether the vegetables alone are responsible for the observed health benefits. The media frequently contributes to the confusion between correlation and causation by reporting studies with misleading headlines. A news article might claim spending more time on social media causes depression in teenagers, based on a study that found a correlation between high social media use and depression. However, the study does not necessarily prove causation. It is possible that teenagers who are already depressed spend more time on social media as a coping mechanism, or that an external factor, such as social isolation, contributes to both high social media use and depression. Without deeper analysis, jumping to conclusions based on correlation alone can create unnecessary panic and misinformation. In business and economics, mistaking correlation for causation can lead to costly mistakes. A company might notice that when they spend more on advertising, their sales increase. This could lead them to believe that increasing their advertising budget will always result in higher sales. However, other factors may be influencing sales, such as seasonal demand, product quality, or market trends. If the company increases advertising without considering these variables, they might waste money on ineffective marketing strategies. The stock market is another area where correlation versus causation mistakes frequently occur. Investors often look for patterns in stock price movements, but just because two stocks tend to rise and fall together does not mean one is causing the other to move. External factors such as changes in interest rates or economic conditions may be affecting both stocks simultaneously. Relying on correlations without understanding the underlying causes can lead to poor investment decisions. One of the most humorous yet illustrative examples of the correlation versus causation fallacy is the relationship between the number of films Nicolas Cage appears in and the number of people who drown in swimming pools each year. Data has shown a strong correlation between these two variables, but no reasonable person would argue that Nicolas Cage movies cause people to drown. This is an example of a spurious correlation where two unrelated variables appear to be connected purely by coincidence. The existence of such bizarre correlations highlights the importance of questioning whether a relationship is meaningful or merely a random statistical anomaly. So how can we avoid falling for the correlation versus causation fallacy? One effective approach is to ask whether an alternative explanation exists. Could there be a third variable influencing both correlated events? Could the causation be reversed, with the supposed effect actually being the cause? Are there other studies or experiments that support the causal claim? These questions help uncover the real nature of the relationship between variables. Another strategy is to look for controlled experiments rather than observational studies. In a well-designed experiment, researchers manipulate one variable while keeping all other conditions the same. If a change in the manipulated variable consistently leads to a change in another variable, causation is more likely. Without such controlled conditions, observational studies alone cannot definitively prove causation. Understanding the difference between correlation and causation is essential for making informed decisions in science, health, business, and everyday life. Recognizing this fallacy helps prevent misinformation, reduces the influence of misleading claims, and encourages critical thinking. By demanding better evidence and questioning assumptions, we can avoid being misled by mere correlations and focus on discovering real causes behind observed patterns. Hasty generalization is a logical fallacy that occurs when someone makes a broad conclusion based on a small or unrepresentative sample. This type of reasoning leads to oversimplified beliefs, inaccurate stereotypes, and flawed decision-making. It is a common mistake in everyday thinking, media reports, and even scientific studies when insufficient evidence is used to support a sweeping claim. Consider a situation where someone visits a new city and encounters two rude people. They then conclude everyone in this city is rude. This assumption is based on an extremely limited sample size, just two people. The city may have millions of residents, and the behavior of a few individuals does not accurately reflect the entire population. Yet, hasty generalizations like this happen all the time, leading to unfair prejudices and misconceptions. One of the main reasons people fall into the trap of hasty generalization is the human tendency to look for patterns. Our brains are wired to make sense of the world by identifying trends and forming quick conclusions. While this ability is useful for survival, it can also lead us to draw faulty inferences from incomplete data. When we see a few instances of a behavior or characteristic, we may assume that it applies universally, even when we lack sufficient evidence. Stereotypes are one of the most common manifestations of hasty generalization. For example, if someone meets a few individuals from a particular country who happen to be reserved or quiet, they might conclude that all people from that country are shy or unfriendly. This ignores the diversity of personalities within any population. Similarly, if a few young people are seen behaving irresponsibly, someone might generalize that all young people lack maturity. These kinds of generalizations contribute to discrimination, misunderstanding, and social division. Hasty generalization is frequently found in discussions about gender, race, nationality, age, and profession. Statements like men are bad at expressing emotions, teenagers are always on their phones, or politicians are all corrupt stem from a limited number of experiences rather than objective analysis. These claims ignore variations among individuals and fail to recognize the complexity of human behavior. In the realm of media news, hasty generalization can be especially dangerous. Sensational headlines often rely on isolated incidents to create broad narratives. If a crime is committed by a member of a particular ethnic group, some people may generalize that all members of that group are prone to criminal behavior. This is not only unfair but also misleading. It ignores statistical realities and fuels harmful biases. Similarly, when a scientific study finds a minor correlation between two factors, media outlets might exaggerate the findings with headlines like "Eating chocolate makes you smarter," when the actual study may not have established a causal link. The fallacy of hasty generalization also plays a significant role in politics. Politicians and public figures may use isolated examples to support broad claims about policies, social issues, or entire demographics. For instance, if one person is caught misusing government assistance, a politician might argue, "Welfare programs encourage laziness." This conclusion ignores the vast majority of people who rely on assistance for legitimate reasons. Such rhetoric can shape public opinion in ways that are not based on accurate representative data. Hasty generalization can also appear in personal relationships and daily interactions. If someone has a bad experience with one member of a profession, such as a rude waiter or an incompetent mechanic, they might assume that all waiters are unfriendly or all mechanics are dishonest. This mindset can lead to unwarranted distrust and negative interactions with others in the future. Even in science, where rigorous methods are meant to prevent errors in reasoning, hasty generalization can be a problem. If a medical study tests a new drug on only a small group of participants and then claims that the drug is effective for the entire population, this would be a form of hasty generalization. Without testing a diverse and large sample, researchers cannot confidently apply their findings to everyone. This is why well-designed scientific studies emphasize large representative samples and peer-reviewed replication before drawing broad conclusions. To avoid falling into the trap of hasty generalization, it is crucial to evaluate the size and representativeness of the sample before making a broad claim. Asking questions such as, how many examples do I have? And are these examples representative of the larger group? Can help determine whether a conclusion is valid. Seeking additional evidence and considering alternative explanations also help prevent rash judgments. Another way to avoid this fallacy is to recognize when emotions or biases influence our thinking. People often generalize hastily when they feel strongly about an issue. If someone has a negative experience with a particular airline, they may be tempted to say, "This airline is the worst. They always mess things up." However, stepping back and considering whether the experience was an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern can lead to a more rational assessment. Critical thinking and skepticism are essential tools for combating hasty generalization. When encountering claims that seem overly broad, it helps to ask, what evidence supports this? And could there be other factors at play? Being aware of this fallacy allows us to approach information with a more thoughtful and discerning mindset, leading to fairer, more accurate conclusions. Ultimately, hasty generalization is a natural but flawed way of thinking. While our brains are wired to look for patterns and shortcuts, recognizing the limitations of small samples and incomplete information can prevent us from making unfair judgments. By questioning assumptions, seeking diverse perspectives, and relying on solid evidence, we can make better decisions and contribute to a more reasoned and informed society. The red herring fallacy is one of the most deceptive yet common tactics used in debates, discussions, and everyday conversations. It occurs when an irrelevant topic is introduced to distract from the original issue, diverting attention and shifting the focus away from the matter at hand. Named after the practice of using the scent of a smoked fish to mislead hunting dogs from their intended trail, the red herring fallacy serves as a diversionary tactic often employed to avoid difficult questions, manipulate an audience, or simply derail a discussion. A classic example of this fallacy can be found in political discourse. Suppose a politician is asked about their stance on climate change policies and they respond by saying, "Why are we even talking about climate change when there are starving children in the world?" While hunger is indeed a serious issue, it has no direct relevance to the topic of climate change. This response shifts the conversation away from the original question and onto an entirely different issue, preventing meaningful discussion on the first topic. The goal of a red herring is not to provide an answer or engage in a productive dialogue, but to distract, evade, or manipulate. The red herring fallacy is particularly effective because it appeals to emotions, moral concerns, or unrelated but pressing issues, making it difficult for people to recognize the diversion. By introducing another topic, often one that elicits a strong emotional response, the speaker can steer the audience's attention away from the original point and into territory where they feel more comfortable or in control. This fallacy is frequently used in debates, media discussions, and personal arguments. Imagine someone is criticized for their poor work performance. Instead of addressing the criticism, they respond with, "Well, what about Sarah? She's even worse at her job than I am." By bringing up another person's performance, they deflect attention away from their own shortcomings, avoiding responsibility and accountability. The issue of Sarah's performance is irrelevant to the question of whether the original person is doing their job well, yet the introduction of her name shifts the focus away from the problem at hand. The red herring fallacy is also a favorite tool in legal arguments and courtroom strategies. Defense attorneys may attempt to divert jurors' attention away from incriminating evidence by introducing unrelated or emotionally charged topics. For example, if a defendant is accused of financial fraud, their lawyer might highlight their charitable donations or their difficult childhood. While these details may elicit sympathy, they do not change the facts of the case. By shifting attention to an unrelated topic, the defense attempts to sway the jury's emotions rather than allowing them to focus on the actual evidence. Advertising and marketing campaigns frequently employ red herrings to distract consumers from potential shortcomings of a product or service. A company facing backlash over unethical labor practices might launch an ad campaign emphasizing its charitable contributions. While corporate philanthropy is commendable, it does not address or excuse the exploitation of workers. The goal is to divert public attention from criticism and instead focus on a more favourable aspect of the company's image. The red herring fallacy is also prevalent in online discussions and social media debates. When people feel cornered or unable to counter an argument with facts, they may resort to throwing out unrelated points to confuse or derail the conversation. For instance, in a discussion about healthcare reform, one might say, well, why don't we talk about how corrupt politicians are instead, while political corruption is an issue? It does not address the original argument about healthcare policies. Yet, by shifting the conversation, the person successfully avoids engaging with the topic at hand. One of the most harmful aspects of the red herring fallacy is that it prevents meaningful discussion and resolution of important issues. When people engage in productive debates, they can examine ideas critically, challenge assumptions, and seek solutions. However, when red herrings are introduced, they sidetrack conversations, making it difficult to focus on the central issue. This can be especially damaging in areas such as politics, public policy, and social justice, where clear and focused discussion is necessary to enact meaningful change. Recognizing and countering the red herring fallacy is essential for maintaining logical and productive discussions. One of the best ways to deal with a red herring is to call attention to the distraction. If someone introduces an unrelated issue, pointing out the diversion can help steer the conversation back on track. For example, in response to the climate change example, one might say, yes, hunger is an important issue, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't also discuss climate change. Let's stay on topic. Another effective strategy is to insist on directly answering the original question before addressing any unrelated points. If someone attempts to change the subject, gently but firmly bringing them back to the initial discussion can prevent the conversation from being derailed. In a debate setting, moderators often play a crucial role in ensuring that red herrings do not take over the discussion by keeping participants focused on the topic at hand. It is also helpful to be aware of one's own potential use of red herrings. In emotionally charged discussions, it is easy to fall into the habit of diverting attention away from difficult subjects. By recognizing this tendency, individuals can make a conscious effort to stay on topic and engage in more honest and logical discussions. In some cases, a red herring may not be intentional. People may introduce unrelated topics simply because they feel passionate about them, or because they mistakenly believe they are relevant. However, whether intentional or not, red herrings still serve to distract from the original issue and should be identified and addressed accordingly. In conclusion, the red herring fallacy is a powerful tool of distraction that is frequently used in debates, politics, advertising, and everyday arguments. By introducing irrelevant topics, individuals can shift focus away from the main issue, avoiding accountability or steering the discussion toward more favourable ground. While this tactic can be persuasive in the short term, it ultimately hinders meaningful conversations and prevents real problem solving. Recognizing and challenging red herrings is crucial for maintaining logical, focused, and productive discussions. By staying vigilant and calling out distractions, we can ensure that important topics receive the attention and critical analysis they deserve. The false analogy fallacy occurs when two things are compared as if they are alike in all relevant aspects, when in reality, they are not. This misleading reasoning can be persuasive because analogies often provide a simple and familiar way to understand complex issues. However, when the comparison is flawed, it leads to incorrect conclusions, misunderstandings, and poor decision-making. A common example of a false analogy is the argument that the government is like a household budget, so we should cut spending. At first glance, this might seem reasonable. After all, both involve managing money, revenues, and expenses. However, governments and households operate under entirely different financial rules and economic principles. A government controls monetary policy, can print money, and makes investments that affect national infrastructure and economic growth. A household, on the other hand, cannot do these things. Treating government spending the same way as household budgeting ignores these fundamental differences, making it an invalid comparison. False analogies often arise in political debates. For example, people sometimes compare a country to a business, arguing that a nation should be run like a company. This analogy fails because a country's primary goal is not to generate profit, but to govern and serve its citizens. Businesses can choose their customers, maximize shareholder value, and eliminate unprofitable ventures. But governments have responsibilities to all citizens, including those who are not economically productive. When leaders use this analogy to justify policies, they risk applying business strategies to situations where they do not belong. Another misleading analogy is comparing human behavior to that of animals, such as saying, lions kill other animals to survive, so violence is natural for humans too. While both lions and humans are biological beings, humans have advanced reasoning, ethical frameworks and social structures that differ vastly from those of wild animals. Justifying human violence by comparing it to predatory behavior in animals ignores these distinctions and oversimplifies complex moral and social issues. The false analogy fallacy is also common in debates about science and technology. A frequent example is the claim that since natural medicine has been used for thousands of years, it must be better than modern medicine. While traditional remedies have historical significance, they do not undergo the rigorous testing, scientific scrutiny and standardization that modern medicine does. Comparing the two as if they are equally effective overlooks the fact that many traditional treatments lack empirical evidence, while modern medicine relies on clinical trials and peer-reviewed research. In discussions about artificial intelligence, some argue that since computers can process information like the human brain, they will eventually think and feel like humans. This analogy is flawed because while computers can simulate cognitive functions, they do not have emotions, consciousness, or subjective experiences. Assuming that artificial intelligence will develop human-like thought simply because it processes information, similarly, is an oversimplification that ignores the complexities of consciousness and neural functioning. False analogies also show up in legal arguments. For example, someone might argue, driving a car and owning a gun are both rights, so gun ownership should be regulated the same way as driving a car. While both involve legal rights and responsibilities, the nature of the risks they pose and the laws surrounding them are different. Driving a car requires extensive training, licensing, and insurance, while gun laws vary widely and are tied to constitutional interpretations. Equating the two oversimplifies the unique considerations involved in firearm regulation. Advertising frequently relies on false analogies to persuade consumers. A company might claim, our skincare product works like a magic eraser on wrinkles. While the metaphor is appealing, skin does not function like paper or a surface that can be instantly erased. By drawing an unrealistic comparison, advertisers create false expectations about how a product will perform. Similarly, weight loss supplements often use before and after comparisons that imply instant results. Even though human metabolism and health are far more complex than a simple cause and effect relationship, education debates also suffer from false analogies. A person might argue, if we can test athletes on their physical performance, we should test students in the same way to measure intelligence. While physical fitness can be measured through standardized tests, intelligence and learning are multidimensional, influenced by factors such as creativity, problem-solving, and emotional intelligence. Treating standardized tests as an absolute measure of intelligence fails to account for these complexities. To avoid being misled by false analogies, it is essential to examine whether the two things being compared share enough relevant similarities. Asking questions like, are these two things fundamentally alike in the ways that matter? And does the comparison ignore important differences? Can help identify weak analogies. If an analogy oversimplifies an issue or ignores key distinctions, it is likely a false analogy. Critical thinking is crucial in recognizing and challenging false analogies. When encountering an argument based on analogy, it is helpful to analyze whether the comparison is valid or if it creates a misleading parallel. Being aware of this fallacy allows people to engage in more logical reasoning and avoid drawing incorrect conclusions based on superficial similarities. In conclusion, the false analogy fallacy is a deceptive reasoning error that arises when two things are compared in ways that ignore their fundamental differences. While analogies can be useful for explaining concepts, they must be accurate and relevant to be logically sound. Whether in politics, business, science, law, or everyday conversation, identifying false analogies helps prevent misinformation and encourages more rational discussions. By critically evaluating comparisons and ensuring they are based on valid similarities, individuals can make more informed decisions and avoid being misled by faulty reasoning. The appeal to ignorance fallacy, also known as argumentum ad ignorantium, occurs when someone argues that a claim must be true simply because it has not been proven false, or that a claim must be false because it has not been proven true. This type of reasoning exploits a lack of evidence as if it were evidence itself, creating a false sense of certainty where none exists. While it might seem convincing at first glance, this fallacy leads to flawed conclusions, encourages misinformation, and often stifles critical thinking. A classic example of this fallacy is the claim that aliens must exist because no one has proven they don't. This statement assumes that the absence of evidence for extraterrestrial life is equivalent to proof of its existence. However, just because we have not found definitive evidence of aliens does not mean they must exist. It simply means we do not yet have sufficient information to draw a conclusion. The same logic can be reversed. Someone might claim aliens do not exist because no one has proven they do. This is also an appeal to ignorance because it treats a lack of proof as if it were proof of absence, which is not logically valid. This fallacy appears frequently in arguments about the supernatural, conspiracy theories, and pseudoscience. For example, a person might say, ghosts are real because no scientist has been able to disprove them. The inability to disprove ghosts does not confirm their existence. It only means that no conclusive evidence has been found either way. Scientific inquiry relies on positive evidence to support claims rather than relying on the absence of disproof as confirmation. Similarly, in the realm of conspiracy theories, people often argue the government is hiding the truth about UFOs because they haven't released all the information. While secrecy may suggest that some information is being withheld, it does not automatically mean that the specific claim in question is true. The burden of proof lies with the person making the claim, not on others to disprove it. Religious and philosophical debates often involve the appeal to ignorance as well. One might say, God must exist because no one has proven otherwise. Or conversely, God cannot exist because no one has proven his existence. Both statements commit the same logical error by assuming that the lack of definitive proof is enough to settle a deeply complex question. A more reasonable approach would be to acknowledge that belief in such matters is based on faith, philosophy, and personal experience rather than definitive empirical proof. Legal arguments can also fall into this type of reasoning. In criminal cases, a defendant is considered innocent until proven guilty. If someone argues this person must be guilty because there is no evidence that they are innocent, they are committing the appeal to ignorance fallacy. A lack of evidence proving innocence is not the same as evidence of guilt. This principle is the foundation of the legal system, ensuring that people are not convicted based on insufficient evidence. Science and medicine often have to contend with the appeal to ignorance fallacy when dealing with unproven treatments or health claims. For example, someone might argue, this herbal remedy must be effective because no one has proven that it isn't. However, medical treatments require rigorous testing and scientific evidence to be considered effective. The fact that a treatment has not been definitively disproven does not mean it works. It simply means there is no strong evidence either way. This is why scientific studies rely on controlled experiments and peer-reviewed research rather than arguments based on ignorance. This fallacy is also used in debates about new technology and fears surrounding its use. For example, someone might argue, artificial intelligence will inevitably take over the world because no one has proven that it won't. While AI development presents ethical and practical challenges, assuming a worst-case scenario simply because it has not been ruled out ignores the need for empirical evidence and reasonable forecasting. Political rhetoric often relies on this fallacy to manipulate public opinion. A politician might say, my opponent must be corrupt because no one has proven otherwise. This unfairly places the burden of proof on the accused rather than requiring the accuser to provide evidence. Similarly, governments may use the appeal to ignorance to justify invasive policies, such as arguing we must assume that every citizen is a potential threat until they prove they are not. This type of reasoning can lead to paranoia, misinformation, and violations of individual rights. To avoid falling for the appeal to ignorance fallacy, it is important to remember that the burden of proof lies with the person making the claim. If someone asserts that something is true, they must provide evidence to support it. It is not the responsibility of others to disprove it. Instead of accepting claims based on a lack of disproof, a more logical approach is to withhold judgment until there is sufficient evidence to draw a conclusion. A good way to challenge this fallacy in discussions is to ask, what evidence do you have to support this claim? If the response is simply that no one has disproven it, that is a clear sign of an appeal to ignorance. Encouraging critical thinking and demanding positive evidence can help prevent misinformation from spreading and lead to more rational decision-making. Additionally, understanding the difference between absence of evidence and evidence of absence is crucial. Just because we do not have proof of something does not mean it must be true or false. Science and logic require us to suspend judgment until reliable evidence emerges rather than filling in the gaps with assumptions. The appeal to ignorance fallacy can have significant real-world consequences. It is frequently exploited by those promoting misinformation, unfounded fears, or pseudoscientific beliefs. Recognizing and challenging this type of faulty reasoning is essential for promoting logical discourse, sound decision-making, and scientific literacy. By shifting the focus away from a lack of evidence and toward the requirement of positive proof, we can ensure that arguments are based on reason rather than speculation. In conclusion, the appeal to ignorance is a fallacy that argues something must be true simply because it has not been proven false, or vice versa. It is commonly found in debates about supernatural beliefs, conspiracy theories, legal arguments, medicine, politics, and science. While the absence of evidence may indicate that more research is needed, it does not justify making definitive claims. To think critically and engage in logical reasoning, we must always demand positive proof for assertions rather than accepting claims based on a lack of disproof. Recognizing this fallacy helps promote intellectual honesty and prevents us from being misled by unfounded assumptions. The bandwagon fallacy is a logical fallacy that occurs when someone argues that a belief, action, or position must be true or good simply because many people endorse it. This fallacy plays on social pressure and the human desire to conform, rather than providing logical reasoning or evidence to support the claim. The assumption behind this fallacy is that popularity is equivalent to correctness, which is not always the case. Just because a majority believes something does not necessarily make it true, ethical, or beneficial. One of the most common expressions of the bandwagon fallacy is the phrase, "Everyone's doing it, so it must be right." This statement assumes that because an idea or behavior is widespread, it must be logically sound or morally justified. However, history has shown that large groups of people can be wrong about significant issues. Slavery, segregation, and the rejection of scientific truths such as the Earth being round or orbiting the Sun were once widely accepted beliefs, yet they were ultimately proven incorrect. The bandwagon fallacy often appears in advertising and marketing. Companies frequently use phrases such as America's favorite brand or 9 out of 10 people prefer this product to convince consumers that they should buy something because it is popular. While social proof can be a useful heuristic for making decisions, it does not constitute actual evidence of quality or value. A product may be popular due to effective marketing rather than superior functionality. Similarly, the bandwagon fallacy is prevalent in politics. Politicians often argue that their policies or ideologies are correct because they have mass public support. For example, a candidate might say, "Millions of people support this bill, so it must be the right choice." However, public opinion is not always based on careful reasoning or deep understanding of complex issues. People are influenced by propaganda, media bias, peer pressure, and emotional appeals, which means that widespread support does not necessarily indicate the merit of a policy. Social movements and trends can also be affected by the bandwagon fallacy. Consider the way certain diets, fitness fads, or self-help trends gain popularity. People often jump on the bandwagon of a new health trend without evaluating the scientific evidence behind it. Just because a particular diet is followed by millions does not mean it is the healthiest or most effective choice. The same applies to financial advice, investment strategies, or technological innovations. Popularity does not guarantee reliability or success. In discussions about morality and ethics, the bandwagon fallacy can lead to dangerous justifications. Historically, many harmful practices have been defended with arguments like, "It's always been done this way," or "Everyone else believes this." These justifications ignore the need for ethical evaluation based on reason, justice, and evidence. A practice does not become morally right just because it has been widely accepted in the past. Religious and philosophical debates also encounter the bandwagon fallacy. Some people argue most of the world believes in a higher power, so it must be true, or conversely, many people are becoming atheists, so religion must be false. The number of people who hold a belief does not determine its truth. Instead, beliefs should be assessed based on evidence, logic, and reasoned argumentation rather than mere popularity. The bandwagon fallacy also plays a significant role in social media and internet culture. Viral trends, misinformation, and online outrage often spread because of the sheer number of people engaging with them. People may accept false information simply because it has been widely shared, assuming that popularity equates to credibility. This is why misinformation can be so powerful. It gains traction not because it is true, but because it is widely believed and repeated. Groupthink, a psychological phenomenon where individuals conform to the dominant views of a group to maintain harmony, is closely related to the bandwagon fallacy. In environments where dissent is discouraged, people may adopt the majority opinion without critically analysing it. This can lead to poor decision-making, as seen in historical events such as the Bay of Pigs invasion or the financial crisis of 2008, where many people followed the majority despite clear warning signs. One of the dangers of the bandwagon fallacy is that it discourages independent thinking. When people rely on popularity as a measure of truth, they may neglect critical analysis, research, and personal judgment. This can result in blind conformity, where individuals accept ideas without questioning their validity. True understanding requires looking beyond what is popular and examining evidence, logic, and ethical principles. To counteract the bandwagon fallacy, it is essential to develop critical thinking skills. Instead of accepting something as true or good simply because it is popular, one should ask, what evidence supports this claim, and are there logical reasons for believing this aside from its popularity? Additionally, being aware of social influence and the pressure to conform can help individuals make more informed decisions. Educational institutions, media outlets, and public discourse should emphasize the importance of independent reasoning over social conformity. Encouraging people to evaluate claims based on merit rather than popularity leads to a more rational and informed society. Recognizing and avoiding the bandwagon fallacy empowers individuals to think critically, resist manipulation, and make decisions based on reason rather than social pressure. In conclusion, the bandwagon fallacy is a flawed form of reasoning that assumes something is true or good simply because many people believe it. While popularity can sometimes indicate value, it is not a substitute for evidence, logic, or ethical consideration. This fallacy appears in advertising, politics, social movements, morality debates, and online discourse, often leading to poor decision-making and blind conformity. To avoid being misled by this fallacy, individuals must cultivate critical thinking, question assumptions, and seek truth based on sound reasoning rather than mere popularity. The no true Scotsman fallacy is a logical fallacy in which a person redefines the criteria of a group or category to exclude counterexamples that disprove their claim. Instead of acknowledging that their original assertion was flawed or overgeneralized, they shift the goalposts by adjusting the definition of the group. This fallacy is named after an example in which someone claims, "No Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge." If presented with a counterexample of a Scotsman who does, they respond, "Well, no true Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge." The intent is to preserve their original assertion by redefining what it means to be a true member of the group, rather than admitting they were mistaken. This fallacy appears in many areas of discussion, including politics, religion, ethics, and personal identity. One of the most common places where the no true Scotsman fallacy emerges is in debates over ideological purity. For example, in political discourse, someone might say, "No true Conservative would support government-funded healthcare." If presented with an example of a Conservative who does support it, they may argue, "Well, they're not a true Conservative." This attempt to exclude counterexamples does not address the reality that political identities are complex and diverse, but instead seeks to protect the speaker's oversimplified definition of what it means to belong to a political group. Religious discussions often feature this fallacy as well. For example, a person might claim no true Christian would ever support war, only to be confronted with historical and contemporary examples of Christians who do. Instead of revising their claim, they might respond, "Well, those people aren't real Christians." This redefinition serves to dismiss counterexamples rather than engage with them critically. The same pattern occurs in nearly every belief system, whether religious, philosophical, or ideological. The problem is that belief systems are broad and varied, with many interpretations, and attempting to enforce a rigid definition often ignores historical, cultural, and theological complexities. Personal identity is another area where this fallacy frequently occurs. People often claim that no true vegan would eat cheese, or no true feminist would oppose affirmative action. When presented with counterexamples of vegans who occasionally eat dairy or feminists who have nuanced views on policy, rather than accepting that people within these categories can hold differing perspectives, they redefine the category to exclude the inconvenient example. This creates an unrealistic expectation of ideological purity and disregards the diversity of thought within any group. The no true Scotsman fallacy can also be seen in nationalistic and cultural debates. Someone might say no true American would criticize their country, implying that patriotism requires unconditional support. If someone provides examples of Americans who are critical of government policies or historical injustices, the response may be, they're not real Americans. This form of argumentation not only dismisses legitimate critiques, but also creates an exclusionary and rigid definition of what it means to belong to a nation or culture. This fallacy is also prevalent in discussions about expertise and professional identity. Someone might argue, no true scientist doubts climate change, and if presented with an example of a scientist who is skeptical, they might respond, well, they're not a real scientist. While it is true that the overwhelming majority of climate scientists support the consensus on climate change, the correct response would be to examine the credentials and arguments of dissenting voices rather than dismissing them outright by redefining who qualifies as a scientist. This does not mean all opinions are equally valid, but rather that exclusion based on an arbitrary definition is not a valid form of argument. The no true Scotsman fallacy is particularly dangerous because it prevents honest engagement with counter-arguments. Instead of confronting new evidence or revising one's perspective, it allows people to dismiss contradictions outright. This reinforces ideological echo chambers where beliefs go unchallenged and dissenting views are automatically disqualified rather than considered. This is especially problematic in online discourse where ideological purity tests are common, and those who do not conform to a rigid standard are often ostracized from their communities. One reason this fallacy is so effective is that people have a natural tendency to protect their beliefs. When confronted with evidence that contradicts a strongly held view, cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort that arises from holding conflicting ideas, kicks in. Rather than modify their belief to accommodate the new information, many people instinctively adjust the definition of their belief to exclude the contradictory evidence. This allows them to maintain their worldview without having to grapple with complexity. A related issue is that the no true Scotsman fallacy can create unrealistic standards that few people can actually meet. If the definition of a true member of any group becomes increasingly narrow, fewer and fewer people will fit the description. This is often seen in political movements where purist attitudes drive out moderate voices, leaving only the most extreme members. Over time, this can lead to fragmentation and infighting, as even small differences become grounds for exclusion. So how can one avoid falling into the no true Scotsman fallacy? The first step is recognizing when it is being used. If an argument hinges on redefining a category rather than addressing evidence, it is likely an example of this fallacy. Instead of saying no true member of this group would believe that, a better approach is to acknowledge that groups are diverse and that counterexamples do not necessarily invalidate a broader trend. It is important to engage with the actual arguments being presented rather than dismissing them based on a redefinition of terms. Additionally, rather than making sweeping generalizations about what members of a group believe or do, it is more accurate to say, most people in this group believe this, or this belief is common among members of this group. This allows room for nuance and acknowledges that variation exists. Intellectual humility is also key. Being willing to revise one's beliefs when confronted with new evidence is a hallmark of rational thinking. Understanding the no true Scotsman fallacy also helps in identifying when others use it to dismiss valid counter-arguments. If someone argues that a counterexample does not count because the person involved is not a true member of a group, it is worth questioning how they define membership and whether that definition is being arbitrarily adjusted to fit their argument. Asking them to clarify their definition and explain why the counterexample does not fit often reveals the fallacy at play. In conclusion, the no true Scotsman fallacy is a form of faulty reasoning that seeks to protect an assertion from counterexamples by arbitrarily redefining the criteria of group membership. It appears in political debates, religious discussions, identity politics, and many other areas of discourse. By recognizing and avoiding this fallacy, One can engage in more honest and meaningful discussions that allow for nuance and complexity rather than relying on rigid and exclusionary definitions. The key to avoiding this trap is intellectual humility, critical thinking, and a willingness to accept that no group is perfectly homogeneous. By resisting the urge to shift definitions to exclude inconvenient evidence, we can move toward a more open and rational approach to debate and discussion. Begging the question is a logical fallacy in which an argument's conclusion is assumed within its premise. Rather than offering independent support for a claim, the argument simply restates the conclusion in a slightly different way or assumes it is true from the start. This creates a circular reasoning loop where no real evidence is provided, making the argument logically invalid and unpersuasive. One of the most common ways this fallacy manifests is in statements like, "She's trustworthy because she's honest." The problem with this argument is that trustworthy and honest are closely related concepts, and the claim that she is honest is not supported by independent evidence. Instead, the argument assumes what it is trying to prove. In order to establish trustworthiness, one must provide examples of trustworthy behavior, not simply redefine the concept with a synonymous term. The phrase begging the question is often misunderstood in casual conversation. Many people use it to mean raises the question, as in, his sudden resignation begs the question, what happened? However, in logic and philosophy, begging the question specifically refers to circular reasoning where the conclusion is presupposed rather than demonstrated. Begging the question is a deceptive fallacy because it can make an argument seem valid on the surface. The repetition of a claim in different wording can give the illusion of reasoning when, in reality, no new information is being provided. This fallacy often appears in everyday discourse, politics, religion, marketing, and even scientific discussions. In politics, candidates and advocates frequently use begging the question to make their position seem self-evident. For example, a politician might say, "We must pass this new law because it is the right thing to do." This statement assumes that the law is right without providing any justification. A proper argument would explain why the law is beneficial or necessary rather than simply asserting its correctness. Religious and philosophical discussions also commonly fall into this pattern. A person might claim, "The Bible is the Word of God because it says so in the Bible." This argument assumes the authority of the Bible to prove its own authority. To make a compelling case, external evidence or reasoning would be required to establish why the Bible should be considered authoritative in the first place. In marketing and advertising, companies often rely on begging the question to promote their products. A commercial might claim, "This is the best toothpaste because it's the most effective." Without providing evidence of its effectiveness, the argument merely restates its claim. A stronger argument would cite clinical studies, customer testimonials, or comparisons with other brands to support the assertion. Even scientific discussions can fall into this fallacy if conclusions are assumed rather than demonstrated. For instance, a researcher might say, "This theory must be true because all scientists agree on it." While scientific consensus is important, the validity of a theory should rest on empirical evidence, experimentation, and logical reasoning, not simply the agreement of experts. This is why peer review and ongoing scrutiny are essential in scientific progress. Begging the question is particularly dangerous because it can shut down meaningful debate. If a person assumes their conclusion is already proven, they have no reason to consider opposing viewpoints or seek out additional evidence. This can lead to intellectual stagnation where people cling to beliefs without critically examining them. It also weakens public discourse, as discussions become circular and unproductive rather than based on genuine reasoning and persuasion. One reason this fallacy is so common is that it often goes unnoticed. Because the conclusion and premise are worded differently, they can appear to be distinct when they are actually the same claim. To identify this fallacy, one must ask, does the argument provide actual evidence, or does it simply restate the conclusion? If no independent support is given, the argument is guilty of begging the question. To avoid this fallacy, one must ensure that their arguments provide independent reasoning or evidence rather than assuming the conclusion. Instead of saying we should believe in democracy because democratic principles are good, one could provide specific reasons why democracy leads to better governance, protects rights, and promotes stability. Instead of saying this medicine is effective because it works well, one should provide clinical trial results and research data to demonstrate its effectiveness. Recognizing and avoiding begging the question leads to stronger, more persuasive arguments. It encourages deeper thinking, better reasoning, and more productive discussions. By demanding independent support for claims rather than accepting circular reasoning, individuals can engage in more meaningful debates and make better informed decisions. In conclusion, begging the question is a fallacy in which an argument assumes its conclusion rather than proving it. This form of circular reasoning appears in politics, religion, marketing, science, and everyday conversations. Because it often goes unnoticed, it can make weak arguments seem convincing. To combat this fallacy, individuals must critically evaluate whether arguments provide independent evidence or merely restate their claims. By doing so, they can foster more rational discussions and develop stronger, more logically sound beliefs. The appeal to tradition is a logical fallacy that argues something is better, correct, or necessary simply because it has always been done that way. This type of reasoning assumes that longevity or historical continuity automatically equates to validity, dismissing the possibility that change might be necessary or beneficial. The fundamental flaw in this argument is that just because something has been practiced for a long time does not necessarily mean it is the best or most effective approach. One of the most common examples of the appeal to tradition is in discussions about energy use. Someone might argue, we should keep using fossil fuels because that's what we've always done. This argument ignores the fact that alternative energy sources such as solar and wind have become more viable and necessary due to environmental concerns. Just because fossil fuels have powered industry for centuries does not mean they remain the best option today. Progress and technological advancements often render old methods obsolete or inefficient. This fallacy frequently appears in debates about education. Many people resist changes to school curricula or teaching methods, arguing this is how we've always taught, so it must be the best way. However, educational research has shown that new approaches, such as active learning and individualized instruction, can be more effective than traditional rote memorization and lecture-based teaching. Clinging to outdated methods simply because they are familiar can hinder progress and innovation. Appeal to tradition is also prevalent in cultural and social norms. Traditions are often deeply ingrained in societies, making them difficult to challenge. For instance, arguments against gender equality, racial integration, or LGBTQ+ rights have historically relied on the idea that things have always been this way. However, the fact that a practice has been maintained for generations does not mean it is just or appropriate. Many traditions that were once considered normal, such as slavery, segregation, and denying women the right to vote, have been abolished because society recognized their inherent injustice. Legal and political systems are also susceptible to this fallacy. Many outdated laws remain in place simply because they have been on the books for a long time. When challenged, defenders of these laws often argue this is how it has always been done. However, legal systems must evolve to reflect contemporary ethics and social values. Laws that once seemed reasonable may become outdated due to new circumstances, technologies, or moral perspectives. Another domain where appeal to tradition plays a significant role is in business and industry. Many organizations resist change by arguing, we've always done it this way and it has worked for us. However, markets, consumer behaviors, and technologies constantly evolve. Companies that fail to adapt risk becoming obsolete. Blockbuster Video, for example, once dominated the home entertainment industry but refused to embrace digital streaming, believing traditional video rental was the best approach. This adherence to an outdated model ultimately led to its demise. Religious and spiritual beliefs often rely on traditional practices. Many religious customs have been followed for centuries, and believers may argue that they should continue because they are long-standing traditions. While tradition can be valuable in maintaining cultural heritage and personal faith, it is important to question whether specific practices are still relevant or beneficial in modern society. For example, some religious traditions have evolved over time to accommodate new understandings of morality and ethics, while others have remained rigid, creating conflicts with contemporary values. Medicine and healthcare also provide clear examples of the dangers of the appeal to tradition. Many medical treatments and practices were used for centuries before scientific advancements proved them ineffective or even harmful. For instance, bloodletting was once a widely accepted medical practice, used to treat everything from infections to mental illness. However, modern medicine has shown that bloodletting is rarely beneficial and can be dangerous. Clinging to outdated medical treatments simply because they have a long history can prevent progress and harm patients. One reason the appeal to tradition is so persuasive is that people often feel comforted by the familiar. Change can be unsettling, and traditions provide a sense of stability and continuity. Additionally, many people associate tradition with wisdom, assuming that if something has been practiced for generations, it must be based on sound reasoning. However, this assumption overlooks the fact that traditions can persist for reasons other than effectiveness, such as habit, social pressure, or resistance to change. Another reason people fall into this fallacy is the mistaken belief that past generations must have known better. While historical knowledge and experience are valuable, they are not infallible. Scientific and technological advancements have allowed humanity to refine and improve many aspects of life, from medicine to communicate ion to governance. Relying solely on tradition ignores the potential for improvement and better solutions. A key way to counter the appeal to tradition is to ask whether the practice in question has inherent value beyond its age. Instead of accepting something as correct simply because it is traditional, one should evaluate whether it is still relevant, effective, and beneficial. A good way to test this is by considering alternatives and weighing the evidence for and against them. For example, in education, rather than assuming traditional methods are best, one could compare student outcomes using different teaching approaches. Another strategy is to recognize that while tradition can have cultural or sentimental value, this does not necessarily mean it should dictate policy or decision-making. Traditions can be respected and preserved in personal or cultural contexts, while still allowing for progress and modernization in other areas. For example, celebrating traditional holidays and customs can be meaningful, but this does not mean that outdated social norms associated with those traditions should remain in place. In some cases, traditions may still hold value and should not be discarded simply for the sake of change. The key is to distinguish between traditions that continue to serve a useful purpose and those that persist solely out of habit. For instance, some traditional agricultural practices are environmentally sustainable and beneficial, while others, such as excessive pesticide use, have been replaced by better alternatives. Ultimately, the appeal to tradition is a fallacy because it relies on longevity rather than logical reasoning or evidence. Just because something has always been done a certain way does not mean it is the best or only way to do it. By critically evaluating traditions and being open to change, individuals and societies can make more informed, effective decisions. Progress depends on the willingness to question old assumptions and consider new possibilities, rather than cling to the past out of mere familiarity. In conclusion, the appeal to tradition fallacy argues that something is correct or superior simply because it has been practiced for a long time. This fallacy appears in many areas, including politics, education, religion, business, medicine, and social norms. While tradition can provide comfort and continuity, it should not be used as a substitute for rational evaluation and evidence-based decision-making. Progress requires the ability to question outdated practices, adapt to new information, and recognize that what worked in the past may not always be the best path forward. Cherry-picking is a logical fallacy that occurs when someone selectively chooses evidence that supports their argument while ignoring or dismissing contrary evidence. This tactic creates a misleading or incomplete picture of reality, making an argument seem stronger than it actually is. By emphasizing only favorable data and omitting unfavorable data, cherry-picking distorts the truth and prevents a full, balanced evaluation of a topic. One of the most common examples of cherry-picking can be seen in scientific debates, particularly those involving controversial topics like climate change, nutrition, and medicine. Suppose someone argues that climate change is not real by pointing to a single cold winter as evidence. This ignores the vast amount of scientific data showing long-term global temperature increases. The person is cherry-picking one instance of cold weather while disregarding the broader climate trends. True scientific understanding requires looking at all the data, not just the parts that support a preconceived belief. Another prominent example of cherry-picking appears in the health and wellness industry. Diet fads and alternative medicine proponents often cite specific studies that appear to validate their claims while ignoring larger, more rigorous research that contradicts them. For instance, a company might advertise that a small study found their supplement effective, while disregarding multiple larger studies that found no benefit. This selective presentation of evidence can mislead consumers and contribute to misinformation. Cherry-picking is also rampant in politics, where candidates and advocates highlight statistics or historical examples that support their position while ignoring those that do not. For example, a politician might claim that a tax policy was successful by pointing to a year of economic growth while ignoring other years where the economy declined under the same policy. Similarly, crime statistics can be manipulated by focusing only on certain areas or time periods to push a particular narrative, whether to promote tougher laws or argue against them. By failing to present a complete picture, cherry-picking can deceive the public and skew policy discussions. Religious and philosophical arguments frequently suffer from cherry-picking as well. In theological debates, people often quote religious texts selectively to support their interpretation while ignoring passages that contradict it. This can be seen in discussions about morality, where individuals cite verses that align with their beliefs while disregarding those that are inconvenient or challenge their views. Such selective reading prevents a nuanced or comprehensive understanding of religious teachings. The media, both traditional and social, often engage in cherry-picking, sometimes unintentionally and sometimes deliberately. News outlets may emphasize stories that fit their ideological leanings while downplaying or ignoring others. For example, a news channel with a conservative bias might highlight only negative aspects of a liberal politician's policies, while a left-leaning outlet might do the opposite. This practice contributes to echo chambers, where people only consume information that reinforces their existing beliefs, making it harder for them to see a balanced perspective. Cherry-picking is particularly dangerous in the age of the internet, where misinformation spreads rapidly. With access to vast amounts of information, people can find sources to support almost any claim if they selectively choose their evidence. Social media algorithms exacerbate this problem by feeding users content that aligns with their past interactions, reinforcing cherry-picked narratives and deepening divisions between different ideological groups. One of the reasons cherry-picking is so persuasive is that it appeals to confirmation bias, the human tendency to seek out and favor information that confirms pre-existing beliefs while dismissing information that contradicts them. People naturally prefer evidence that supports their views, which makes them susceptible to selective reasoning. This is why cherry-picking is such a powerful tool in persuasion and propaganda. If someone only hears or sees one side of an argument, they are more likely to accept it as the whole truth. Cherry-picking can also be found in historical interpretations. Many political movements, national narratives, and ideological positions rely on selective historical examples to build their case. For instance, a country may highlight only its noble achievements while downplaying or ignoring instances of oppression, war crimes, or colonialism. Similarly, people arguing for or against socialism, capitalism, or other economic systems may cite only the examples that support their viewpoint while ignoring counterexamples. This selective use of history distorts reality and prevents an honest discussion about complex issues. To counter cherry-picking, it is essential to examine the full body of evidence on any given topic. When evaluating a claim, one should ask, are there studies or facts that contradict this argument? Are multiple perspectives being considered? Is this claim based on the full context or just a convenient subset of data? A commitment to intellectual honesty requires seeking out information that challenges one's beliefs rather than just reinforcing them. One way to avoid falling into the trap of cherry-picking is to adopt a skeptical mindset. Instead of accepting information at face value, critical thinkers should look for patterns across multiple sources and studies. If an argument relies on a single study or anecdote while ignoring larger datasets, it is likely cherry-picking. Peer-reviewed research, meta-analyses, and comprehensive reviews provide more reliable insights than isolated findings taken out of context. Media literacy is also a crucial tool in combating cherry-picking. Recognizing bias in news sources and understanding how information is framed can help individuals identify when selective evidence is being used to manipulate opinions. Seeking out diverse viewpoints, engaging with different perspectives, and verifying claims through multiple sources can reduce the impact of cherry-picking and lead to a more informed worldview. In debates and discussions, it is useful to call out cherry-picking when it occurs. If someone presents selective evidence, asking for a broader context or additional sources can help expose the fallacy. Encouraging open dialogue and evidence-based reasoning rather than relying on selective anecdotes strengthens critical thinking and leads to more productive conversations. Cherry-picking is not always intentional. Sometimes people genuinely believe they are presenting the best evidence because they are unaware of counter-arguments. However, whether intentional or not, cherry-picking leads to misleading conclusions and poor decision-making. The responsibility to avoid this fallacy falls on both individuals making arguments and those evaluating them. Developing the habit of questioning incomplete or one-sided presentations of evidence helps ensure that discussions and decisions are based on a full and accurate understanding of reality. In conclusion, cherry-picking is a logical fallacy that distorts truth by selecting only favourable evidence while ignoring contradictory information. It appears in science, politics, media, religion, and history, often reinforcing biases and misleading audiences. To combat cherry-picking, individuals must critically evaluate claims, seek out diverse perspectives, and prioritise comprehensive evidence over selective reasoning. In a world saturated with information, the ability to recognise and challenge cherry-picking is essential for developing a well-rounded and informed perspective.